Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5-Watt World. We're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. How did the Fender Stratocaster go from being seen as some sort of factory-built gimmick to being the very definition of an electric guitar? I'm going to take us through the development of the Strat and touch on some of the players that were influential in its history. If you enjoy what we're doing here at 5-Watt World, take a minute to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when new videos are released. If you've already subscribed, swing by the store and grab a t-shirt or a mug to support what we're doing here. So when did the Stratocaster start? George Fullerton remembers that around the end of 1951 and the early part of 1952, Leo started working on the pickups. By the latter part of 52, a lot of the work had been done on getting the new guitar project completed. One of the earliest Fender employees, Freddie Tavares, was charged with drawing up the design of the Stratocaster. The influences came from different places. The body design from the Fender Precision basses, the peg head from the early Bigsby guitars. Several features evolved from the Telecaster, plus whole new items like the pickups and the vibrato. It's clear that Leo saw the Stratocaster as an evolution from the Telecaster. And like with the Telecaster, Leo Fender involved many guitarists in the design process. He recalled, about 25% of every day was spent visiting musicians, trying to figure out what would best suit their needs. Upon its release in 1954, the Strat had an ash body with 2 or sometimes 3 pieces glued together. They carved the body with gentle but deep contours in response to players complaining that the hard edges of the Tele were uncomfortable. This led to what Fender called the original contoured body. It was carved on the back to fit against the player's body and sloped on the front where the player's picking arm rests. There was routing on the front and back to house the pickups, controls, and the vibrato assembly, and the routing was covered by the pickguard. Another small plate covered the vibrato mechanism in the back. A cutout on the rear plate allowed for the strings to be fed into the vibrato block, and on the earliest guitars, a serial number was stamped into the top. The one-piece maple neck was assembled in the same way as it was on the Telecaster. The 21 frets were laid directly up into slots in the face of the maple neck. The fingerboard radius was approximately 7 inches. A metal truss rod was set in the channel in the rear of the neck, and the channel was covered with a walnut strip, which would later be referred to by players as the skunk stripe. The truss rod could be adjusted by a screw at the base of the neck near the body, but typically only if the neck was removed from the guitar, fitting with Fender's modular design philosophy. Black plastic dots were laid in the face of the neck, and tiny position markers were laid into the side of the neck. The nut was made of white bone, and the scale length matched that of the Tele at 25.5 inches. If the Tele headstock seemed to be influenced by the single-sided Traverse Bigsby solid body guitar, the Strat headstock certainly brought to mind the old quote, "Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery." Don Randall, head of Fender's distribution and marketing company at the time, recalled of the new headstock design that it was a little more graceful, a little more lutish, a little more Paul Bigsby-ish. 6 inline closed-back Kluson tuners were fitted, with a thin metal shaft and small oval buttons. A small circular string retainer on the headstock kept the E and B strings in place. Decals on the headstock were the black outline gold spaghetti-like Fender, a black Stratocaster, and a black with synchronized tremolo, and a tiny script black that said original contoured body. The body was given a 2-tone sunburst finish, common on Gibson guitars, but it was the first time Fender had used one. It was created by applying 2 coats of different colored nitrocellulose finish. First a yellow for the brighter center, then black around all the edges. A single layer white plastic pickguard was applied with 8 screws. The 3 pickups were identical. White plastic covered a bobbin wound with 42 gauge enamel wire that was wax dipped all around 6 Alnico cylindrical pull pieces. The pull pieces are revealed in the top of each pickup cover, and the pickup was angled at the bridge like on a Telecaster. Early pickup covers were made with Bakelite plastic, which over the years proved to be fragile, leaving many guitars with cracked pickup covers. The guitar was equipped with a 3-way selector switch that would individually choose each of the 3 pickups. The output jack was mounted at an angle in the face of the guitar, separate from the pickguard, in a metal plate. There had been vibrato bars on guitars before of various designs, notably those by Bigsby. But the built-in vibrato on the Strat was by all accounts Leo's pride and joy. Through trial and error, the final version was wildly successful, and Leo applied for a patent for it in August of 1954. It was an adjustable bridge, tailpiece, and vibrato system all in a single unit. It was what Leo Fender did so well, taking an existing idea and improving it with a whole new design. Unlike the Bigsby, where the strings moved over a fixed bridge, often putting the guitar out of tune when the strings hung up on the bridge, Leo's system moved the entire unit, tailpiece and bridge saddles together. The bridge's metal base plate was attached to the body with 6 screws, forward of the saddles, on which the bridge pivoted. The vibrato arm screwed into the base plate. Like on the Telly before, the bridge came with a metal cover, quickly removed and either discarded or repurposed as an ashtray, hence the nickname. The sustain block, or inertial block, extended down from the base plate into the body of the guitar. The strings were fed through the block, through the bridge, over the saddles. The tension of the strings was offset by up to 5 springs that attached the block to the body with an adjustable claw in the body route on the back of the guitar. Those springs allowed for fine-tuning of the stiffness and hence the feel of the vibrato system. The new bridge had 6 bent steel saddles that were each adjustable for height and length. This wasn't the first 6-way adjustable bridge. Giretsch had produced their Melita bridge around 1952, and Gibson's Tune-O-Matic appeared on the Les Paul Custom in 1953. The real innovation here was that the Strat bridge offered adjustment of the height as well as the intonation, something the other 2 bridges did not do. It's well known that Leo was influenced by the car designs of the time. And like the cars, the parts came together to produce an object that was as beautiful as it was functional. Another addition to the long list of 1950 designs that history remembers as simultaneously groundbreaking and timeless. Eric Clapton would later say, "My feeling about a perfect design is that it has to be functional, and with the Strat, its functionality really steers it. That's what makes the design so beautiful. It's superbly thought out." The first batch of 100 Stratocasters were ready to ship, and the first sales slip was dated October 13th, 1954. Don Randall had come up with the name of the Telecaster, and he was also charged with naming the Stratocaster. He said later that his inspiration came from the beginning of the space age and the lure of the stratosphere. Fender set the list price of the Stratocaster at $249.50 plus $39.50 for the case. You could buy a non-vibrato version for $229.50. Despite the mass production efficiencies, it was expensive when compared to the Gibson Gold top, which listed for $225, and the Giretsch Duo Jet for $230 in the same year. It's estimated that by 2010, approximately 3 million Strats had been sold. But in the beginning, the guitar did not catch on right away. Only about 720 Strats were sold in 1954 and 1955 combined, compared to 1,027 Tellys for the same time period. Slowly, as rock and roll grew, so did interest in the guitar, and soon Fender was having trouble keeping up with demand. The big break came on December 1st, 1957, when Buddy Holly and the Crickets performed on The Ed Sullivan Show. Performing his hit, That'll Be the Day, and his new song, Peggy Sue, Holly stood at the front of the band with a shiny new Stratocaster for the TV audience to see. By '56, small changes were already starting to come to the Strat. The bodies were more likely to be made of alder. The neck profile was becoming more pointed in the back, what would later be known as a boat shape or a V. The string guides on the headstock changed from the early round type to the butterfly shape, and in '58 the 2-tone sunburst would change to a 3-tone, adding a layer of red to the yellow and black. Fender was now spending much more on advertising, and the catalogs went full color in 1957-58, announcing new custom colors. A bright red Strat was on the cover of the '58-59 catalog. This was big news, as prior to that most Tellys only came in blonde, and the Strats mostly came in sunbursts. In 1957, Fender announced a Strat in see-through blonde finish with gold hardware. Don Randall's idea, it was likely in response to Gretsch's release of the White Falcon. Unfortunately, the thin gold plating wore off or corroded quickly, so this wasn't a popular option in the long run. But the blonde and gold was Fender's first official custom color Stratocaster. The custom color guitars, with their 5% upcharge, were not particularly popular as an option in the '50s. By the early '60s, Fender issued an official list of available custom colors. Fender used paint from the DuPont Duco color line, and they were heavily influenced by car colors. Even the names came from car catalogs. Fiesta Red, for example, can be traced to Ford's 1956 Thunderbird. According to Fullerton, Fiesta Red was the first true custom color. The marketing guys were much less than enthusiastic, even wondering aloud, who's going to want a colored guitar, especially a red one? The next big change would come in 1959, with the move to a rosewood fingerboard. This was following on the heels of the 1958 Jazzmaster, their new premier model having appeared with a rosewood fingerboard. During 1959, all Fender guitars were switched to a rosewood fingerboard. The position dot markers were correspondingly switched from black plastic to a lighter color now known as clay dots. These earliest Brazilian rosewood boards had a flat base and became known as the slab boards. Fender continued to experiment with the rosewood thickness to get the best sound, and by 1962 had settled on a curved base board, a thin layer of rosewood that is referred to as a laminate board. And maple boards were continued to be offered as an option as well. Also in '59, the one-layer pickguard was changed to the 3-ply, white, black, white. Some believe that the white was somewhat discolored by the layer of black underneath, leaching into the white, creating what is now described as mint green guards. Fender used plastic tortoiseshell pickguards on some of the guitars in the '60s as well. By the late '50s, many blues guitarists were discovering the Stratocaster. Buddy Guy bought a Strat upon relocating to Chicago in 1957 after his Les Paul Gold Top was stolen. Buddy's success with the glassy tone cutting through the mix made many other bluesmen take notice of the Strat. Instrumental electric guitar music was being popularized in the movies. In 1961, Dick Dale had a big hit with Let's Go Trippin', playing his custom gold sparkle finish, left-handed Strat, awash in a sea of reverb. And the Ventures' Walk Don't Run was a big hit in 1960. Before moving to Moss-Wright guitars, the Ventures' Don Wilson used a Stratocaster and Bob Bogle played a Jazzmaster. By 1960, demand from abroad became a part of Fender's growing business, so Don Randall began working out the details. Britain was particularly important as the British invasion was in full swing in the early 60s. Demand for Fender guitars had been preloaded in Britain, perhaps because the government had put a ban in place from 1951 to 1952 on importing certain products from America, which included guitars. In love with American pop music, British singer Cliff Richards wrote to Fender directly asking for a copy of their catalog. He received the 58-59 catalog with the red Strat with gold hardware on the cover. The generous Richards ordered one for his guitarist, Hank Marvin. So just as the ban was lifted, Marvin was playing that red Stratocaster, likely the first one ever in the UK, into his Vox AC30 in front of audiences all over Britain. Fender's success grew steadily in the early 60s, topping out at approximately $40 million worth of retail sales by the middle of the decade. Fender was feeding the boom demand for electric guitars, basses, and amps, and at the peak of its success, Fender was sold in 1965 to Columbia Broadcasting System for a reported $13 million. Despite the fact that CBS had no background in instrument manufacturing, it was buying up instrument companies right and left. The new CBS management were engineers interested primarily in high production volume. Criticism started to come back from dealers right away, complaining that, quote, the guitars don't play like they used to, unquote. In the early 60s, a new chunkier logo started to show up on the other guitars in the line and was added to the Stratocaster in '64. Known among collectors as the Transition logo, because it leads from the original thin spaghetti logo to a bolder all-black version, often referred to as the CBS logo, that was introduced around 1968. In 1965, Fender also began using the neck plates with a stamped F on them, and the F would soon appear on the new tuners as well. The biggest difference to the Strat that came with CBS was the new wider headstock. Jazzmaster and Jaguar guitars were made with bound necks, and in '66, a very few Strats were put out with bound necks as well. The July 1965 performance by Bob Dylan at the Newport Folk Festival turned into a media frenzy when he performed with electric instruments. Dylan showed up playing a black Stratocaster, and his lead player, Mike Bloomfield, played a blonde Telecaster. George Harrison and John Lennon of the Beatles each acquired a Stratocaster in the mid-'60s. Both finished in Sonic Blue. John played his Strat on Ticket to Ride, recorded that January. They used them on an instrumental section of Nowhere Man, including the harmonic at the end. Harrison repainted his into a psychedelic masterpiece and used it in the Magical Mystery Tour movie during the I Am the Walrus sequence. But perhaps the biggest lift the Strat received at the end of the '60s was in the choice of instruments of one James Marshall Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix got his first Strat in 1966. He may well have chosen the Strat because his hero, Curtis Mayfield, was playing one at the time. Early in his career, Jimmy played many rosewood board Strats, but in the last few years of his life, he played maple board ones, one black and one in white. Jimmy played standard right-handed models turned over and restrung to accommodate being left-handed. He said, "The Stratocaster is the best all-around guitar for the stuff we're doing. You can get the very bright trebles and the deep bass sound." Hendrix died tragically in 1970. Eric Clapton tells a story in his autobiography that on a whim he'd bought a left-handed white Stratocaster he'd seen in a shop window for Jimmy, and had carried it to the Sly and Family Stone concert that night where they were to meet up. Clapton only learned the next day that Jimmy had died the night before. Eric Clapton recalls seeing Buddy Holly perform on British television when he was just 12 years old. He purchased his first Strat in 1967 at Sound City in London, a used 1956 Stratocaster, later nicknamed Brownie, that looked very much like the guitar Buddy Holly had played on that TV broadcast. Clapton used the Strat sporadically at the end of Cream, but really moved over to it in late 1969 when he toured with Delaney and Bonnie. In 1970, he recorded his first solo album, Eric Clapton, the London Howlin' Wolf Sessions, and Layla and Other Love Songs, all playing his beloved Brownie. Late in 1970, while Clapton was in Nashville with Derek and the Dominoes, he bought 6 Strats for about $100 each at the Showbud Music Store. Of the 6 guitars purchased, he gave 3 to George Harrison, Pete Townsend, and Steve Winwood. He then took the best parts from each of the remaining 3 and put together a new guitar, Blackie. It had a 57 neck, a refinished black 56 body, and 2 50s pickups, and a third pickup from around 1970. Blackie remained Clapton's main guitar until 1985. Over at CBS-owned Fender, quality continued to slip as the 70s wore on, and many dealers and collectors believe the 70s are the low point for Fender production quality. First, the truss rod adjustment point was moved from the base of the neck to the headstock, the new bullet-shaped adjuster. Second, a tilt neck adjustment was added to make it easier to adjust neck pitch angle. These 2 changes were small enough in themselves, but unfortunately, they coincided with the drop in quality and became emblematic of the problems with the instruments at the time. Dale Hyatt, head of Fender sales at the time, said, "They blamed the new 3-bolt neck, but it wasn't that. You could have put 6 bolts in it and it still would have moved. The neck pockets were being cut oversized, but players were blaming the new 3-bolt neck." The company also moved to its new thick skin finish of dozens of coats of polyester. This finish's plastic appearance makes it clear that a guitar came from the 70s. Blues rock was huge in the 70s, and Irishman Rory Gallagher wielded his battered 61 Strat on stage far and wide. The guitar had been bought by Gallagher, used in a shop in Cork, for £100 in 1963. Over the years to come, the sunburst finish was worn to bare wood over most of the guitar. The pickups were all replaced, the controls were changed to a single volume and a tone, and it was refretted many times. Jeff Beck had long played Les Pauls, but around the time of Beckola, he wanted something more original sounding. He'd had a number of Strats over the years, but the one we likely all know best is from the cover of his album Wired, which was released in 1976. On that album, he played a 1960s white Stratocaster given to him by guitarist John McLaughlin. He used this guitar on tour for many, many years, only retiring it from the road use when his first signature Strat was built in 1991. The original Jeff Beck signature guitars were primarily based on that white, wired guitar. Also in the 70s, Ritchie Blackmore played a Strat in Deep Purple. Curtis Mayfield continued to weave clean Strat tones on soul records, and one can't forget the famous Lights Stratocaster, played by Journey's Neil Schon on Infinity in 1978. Like with Les Pauls in the 60s, players looking for a Fender in the 70s were looking to the 50s and 60s for the magic. The idea that the older guitars were better fueled the search for vintage instruments. Norman's Rare Guitars opened in California in mid-1970s to help meet this demand. The owner, Norm Harris, said succinctly at the time, "You simply can't compare what I have to offer with what the big companies are mass-producing today." Based on the cold reception that the new humbucking-equipped Tellys had received, Fender started to pare back their offerings. The custom colors were eliminated in the late 60s and early 70s. Freddie Tavares was still consulting with Fender and said that though there were some things they wanted to change on the Stratocaster, the attitude at CBS was not to fool with success. As the 70s came to a close, Fender was producing 40,000 instruments a year. The production had grown so much that Fender had even dispensed with putting a date on the base of the neck. These dates, originally written in pencil and later rubber stamped on the neck, were part of the history of the instruments, emphasizing the human hands involved in the build. But from 1973 to the early 80s, Fender stopped doing it altogether. It seems they were either too busy, or they just didn't seem to care. In the mid-1970s, Fender built some Stratocasters using black hardware, knobs, switches, and around 1975, Fender moved to closed-cover tuners bought from the German company Schaller. But by far, the most important change to come out of the 70s was the move to a 5-way pickup selector switch. Clapton had mentioned in a 1970 interview, "I just set the switch between the first and middle pickups. I get a much more rhythm and blues or rock kind of sound that way." The somewhat hollow sound was caused by phase cancellation between the two pickups, creating the characteristic honky sound as well as a drop in volume that players loved. Some aftermarket 5-way switches were produced and instruments were modified, but it took Fender until 1977 to embrace this feature. Remember, early 3-way equipped Strats did not have reverse wound middle pickups. In fact, Strats made in the very desirable pre-CBS period had pickups pulled out of a bin without regard to matching their output levels or to the position where they were being installed. One guitarist who made the most of this tone was Mark Knopfler, who exploded on the scene with the Dire Straits in 1978. Their debut album was covered with the sound of an in-between Strat running through an early 60s brown-faced Vibrolux amp. Knopfler had bought the natural finish 61 Strat in 1977, but had had it refinished in red in honor of his childhood hero, Hank Marvin. In the early 80s, Bill Schultz was hired away from Yamaha to become Fender's president. He set about improving the Strat, returning the truss rod adjustment point to the base of the neck and using a more vintage-style headstock. He also wanted to start production in Japan because American companies were being hammered by the Japanese copies in the marketplace. Schultz cut a deal to create the Japanese Fender Company, with Fujigen building the instruments. While plans were moving forward to build what was effectively copies of classic Fender guitars in Japan, CBS was moving in the same directions back in the States. Around 1980, Freddie Tavares began working on a project to build a vintage Telecaster, a recreation of an original 1952 Tele. They began the vintage reissue program in earnest by buying up original guitars to use as examples. Along with the 52 Tele, the Strats were modeled on a 57 and a Rosewood board 62. These guitars are famous for their extremely thin lacquer coatings, which wore very quickly. Collectors call them Fullerton reissues because of where they were manufactured, and they command a high premium over later reissues. Meanwhile, the first batch of Japanese-made Fender guitars arrived in the States. The head of marketing, Dan Smith, remembered, "Everybody came up to inspect them, and the guys almost cried, because the Japanese product was so good. It was what we were having a hell of a time trying to do." Starting in Europe, the Japanese Fenders were marketed under the name of Squier, but by the end of 1983, under pressure to bring more modestly priced Strats to the US market, the decision was made to bring the Squier guitars to America as well. At the same time, the US-made Strats had some ill-conceived changes. The second tone control was removed, and the distinctive jack plate was removed as well. These changes only lasted until 1985, but they pushed more buyers towards the more reasonably priced and historically correct Japanese Squier guitars. Notable in their headstock shape and contours, the Squier guitars were considerably more accurate to vintage spec than anything Fender was making, separate from the Fullerton reissues. From this period forward into the early 90s, it can be argued that Fender moved away from the roots of the original Stratocaster, trying and failing to better the original design. Still, the 1980s had no lack of famous Stratocaster players, though they were making history mostly on vintage instruments. David Gilmour, a dedicated Stratocaster player from the early days of Pink Floyd, was seen on tour in support of the Wall album. Standing atop a giant wall on stage playing the solo to Comfortably Numb, one of the greatest rock guitar solos of all time. 1983 saw Stevie Ray Vaughan playing his Stratocaster on both Bowie's Let's Dance and his own album, Texas Flood. His Hendrix licks filtered through a rough Texas energy changed our sense of blues rock forever. Vaughan often referred to his Sunburst #1 guitar as a 59, but in fact it had a 62 neck and a 63 body, which is likely how it left the factory, as necks and bodies often sat on racks after being made while waiting to be built into a complete instrument. In the metal world, 1984 saw the release of Yngwie Malmsteen's Rising Force with the iconic image of his 1971 Stratocaster on the cover. And in 1984, a young and relatively unknown Eric Johnson would play a 50 Strat through a wall of amps on the Austin City Limits television show, showing us that the variety of tones you can get from a Stratocaster would clearly carry us through the decades to come. CBS would sell Fender almost exactly 20 years after acquiring the company to an investor group led by then-President William Schultz. And with that, I'll end our tale of the development of the Fender Stratocaster. The company has gone on to create its own custom shop to much acclaim. In fact, a friend of mine believes that the first run of relics made in 96 and 97 are perhaps the finest guitars Fender has ever made. Periodic improvements to the Strat since have generally taken us incrementally back towards the vintage guitars that are so prized today. This video was made possible in no small part by two excellent books: the Stratocaster Guitar Book by Tony Bacon and the Stratocaster Chronicle by Tom Wheeler. I'd also like to thank Perry McManis for fact-checking the manuscript and for his continual insistence that the Stratocaster is the greatest guitar ever made. I'd like to thank Dave Honorato of Dojo Guitar Repair in Atlanta for answering my questions and fact-checking my script. Dave grew up dealing vintage guitars with his dad, and he's where I turn when I need to know these sorts of things. If you're still watching, I'll assume you enjoyed the video, so don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified for new videos. And hit the store link in the description to grab a t-shirt or a mug to support what we're doing here. Until next time, thanks for being a part of the 5 Watt world.